Black Death was one of the deadliest disasters in human history, a plague so devastating that it wiped out nearly half of Europe's population in just a few short years. It arrived in the mid-14th century, spreading at an unstoppable pace and leaving behind a world forever changed. But how did it begin? And why was it so lethal? The origins of the Black Death trace back to the vast trade networks that connected Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Historians believe the outbreak began in the early 1340s in the dry plains of Central Asia, possibly in Mongolia. The disease, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, traveled along the Silk Road, infecting people and animals as it moved westward. It likely reached Europe through trade ships carrying infected rats and fleas, which thrived in the filthy, crowded conditions of medieval ports. By the year 1347, the plague had made its way to the bustling trade city of Kaffa, a Genoese-controlled settlement on the Crimean Peninsula. During a siege by Mongol forces, infected corpses were reportedly catapulted over the city walls, exposing the defenders to the deadly disease. Desperate to escape, Genoese merchants fled by ship, unknowingly carrying the plague to the ports of the Mediterranean. This marked the beginning of Europe's nightmare. The first confirmed cases in Europe appeared in Sicily in the autumn of 1347. Ships arriving in the port of Messina were filled with dying sailors, covered in black boils that oozed pus and blood. Within days, the disease spread through the city like wildfire. Those who tried to flee only carried the plague further inland. From Sicily, it spread rapidly to mainland Italy, reaching Florence, Genoa, and Venice within months. By the following year, it had torn through France and Spain, creeping ever closer to the rest of Europe. Medieval medicine was completely unprepared for a disease of this magnitude. No one understood how the plague spread, and fear led to wild speculation. Some believed it was a punishment from God, sent to cleanse the world of sin. Others blamed bad air, astrological events, or even poisoned wells. With no effective treatments, doctors relied on desperate and often gruesome remedies. Some advised bloodletting, while others recommended carrying flowers to ward off the evil air. But no matter what people tried, nothing stopped the Black Death. By the end of 1348, the plague had turned thriving cities into ghost towns. Corpses piled up faster than they could be buried, and mass graves became the only solution. Fear and panic took hold, and society began to crumble under the weight of so much death. And yet, this was only the beginning. The true scale of the devastation had yet to unfold, and Europe was about to descend into chaos. As the Black Death continued its relentless march across Europe, no region was spared. By the year 1349, the plague had spread deep into France, Germany, and England, devastating communities at an alarming rate. The disease moved so quickly that entire villages were wiped out before word of its approach could even reach them. It seemed as if death was always one step ahead. The symptoms of the Black Death were terrifying. Infected individuals first experienced flu-like signs, fever, chills, and exhaustion. But within a day or two, painful swellings known as buboes formed in the armpits, groin, or neck. These swollen lumps, filled with pus and blood, turned black as the infection worsened, giving the disease its infamous name. Some victims suffered from internal bleeding, coughing up blood as their bodies shut down. Once symptoms appeared, death often followed within days. The sheer speed of the disease overwhelmed cities. In London, Paris, and other major hubs, people fell sick so quickly that hospitals could not keep up. The streets became filled with the dying and the dead, and carts were pulled through towns to collect bodies for mass burials. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the sounds of grieving families echoed through empty streets. The living were forced to move on, leaving their dead behind. With entire households wiped out, social order began to collapse. Government officials, priests, and city leaders either died or fled, leaving towns without structure. Lawlessness took hold in many places. In some regions, those who were sick were boarded up in their homes and left to die in isolation. In others, entire villages were abandoned, the survivors choosing to take their chances elsewhere rather than stay in infected areas. Fear led to desperation, and desperation led to blame. Without scientific understanding, people searched for an explanation. Many believed the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins, leading to an increase in religious fervor. Groups of flagellants roamed the countryside, whipping themselves in public as an act of penance, hoping their suffering would bring an end to the disease. Others turned their fear towards specific groups, fueling violence. Jewish communities, already facing widespread discrimination, were accused of poisoning wells and deliberately spreading the plague. Across Europe, brutal attacks were carried out, with entire Jewish populations being massacred or forced to flee. These false accusations only added to the chaos, deepening the suffering in an already broken world. Yet despite the devastation, the plague showed no sign of stopping. By late 1349, it had reached Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, continuing its deadly journey. The question on everyone's mind was the same: would this ever end? By the year 1350, the Black Death had firmly embedded itself across Europe, leaving an unimaginable trail of death and despair. No region had been spared, and the disease showed no signs of slowing down. The impact was more than just the staggering loss of life. It was reshaping the very foundations of society. One of the most immediate effects was the collapse of the workforce. With so many people dying in such a short time, labor shortages crippled entire industries. Farms were left abandoned, crops rotted in the fields, and food production plummeted. This led to widespread famine as fewer people were left to harvest grain, raise livestock, or transport goods to market. In cities, essential trades and services disappeared overnight. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and merchants were all dying at the same rate as the peasants, leaving no one to maintain basic infrastructure. With labor in such high demand, those who survived found themselves in a new position of power. Wages skyrocketed as landowners and business owners scrambled to hire workers. Peasants, who had once been bound to the land under the strict feudal system, now had leverage for the first time. Many left their lords in search of better pay, triggering a slow but irreversible shift in social structure. The rigid class hierarchy that had defined medieval Europe for centuries was beginning to break apart. At the same time, the fear of the disease had permanently changed how people interacted. Families turned against each other, with parents abandoning sick children and husbands leaving dying wives in an effort to save themselves. Neighbors avoided one another, and once thriving communities became ghost towns. The very concept of trust had been shattered, as no one knew who might be carrying the invisible killer. Medicine was nearly useless in the face of such a powerful disease, but that did not stop doctors from trying. With no understanding of bacteria or viruses, physicians relied on whatever theories they could come up with. Some believed the disease was caused by bad air, leading to the widespread use of fragrant herbs and flowers to ward off infection. Others promoted bizarre treatments like burning aromatic wood, bathing in vinegar, or covering the body with crushed emeralds. None of these methods worked, but people were willing to try anything to escape the horror unfolding around them. Quarantine efforts also became more extreme. In some cities, infected houses were sealed off, leaving those inside to die without medical care or even access to food and water. Ships arriving in ports were forced to wait offshore for weeks before passengers were allowed to disembark. The city of Venice implemented one of the earliest known quarantine policies, requiring ships to remain isolated for a full 40 days before docking, a practice that would later influence modern public health measures. But despite these efforts, the plague continued its relentless spread. By 1351, it had reached the farthest corners of Europe, tearing through what little remained of civilization's stability. The world that had existed before the Black Death was gone, and the survivors were left to navigate an uncertain and unrecognizable future. By the year 1351, the Black Death had reached nearly every part of Europe, and its devastation was beyond anything the world had ever seen. But even as the worst of the outbreak began to fade, its effects were far from over. The survivors faced a world that had been reshaped by death, fear, and desperation. One of the most noticeable changes was the transformation of cities and towns. Many once bustling centers of trade had become abandoned, with entire neighborhoods left empty. The sheer number of deaths had outpaced burial efforts, and in some areas, mass graves stretched across the landscape. Fields that had once been filled with crops now lay untouched, overgrown with weeds, as there were simply not enough people left to tend them. The psychological impact on survivors was profound. The plague had struck without warning, wiping out families, communities, and entire ways of life. Those who lived through it carried deep emotional scars, having witnessed unimaginable suffering. Many people were left without parents, spouses, or children. The concept of family itself had changed, as people who had no remaining relatives were forced to rebuild their lives among strangers. Religious beliefs were also shaken to their core. For centuries, the Catholic Church had been the most powerful institution in Europe, guiding people's faith and daily lives. But the plague had spread so widely and killed so indiscriminately that many began to question why God had allowed such suffering. Some turned to extreme religious devotion, believing the plague was divine punishment that could only be eased through acts of penance. Others lost faith entirely, seeing the church's inability to stop the disease as proof that it was powerless. This shift in religious thinking would eventually contribute to major changes in Europe, including movements that challenged the church's authority. The social order had also been permanently altered. Before the plague, European society had been built on a rigid feudal system where peasants worked the land for lords in exchange for protection. But with the population drastically reduced, labor became more valuable than ever before. Those who survived realized they had options. If one lord refused to pay fair wages, they could leave and work for another. This newfound mobility weakened the traditional system of lords and peasants, setting the stage for the eventual decline of feudalism. Economically, the effects of the Black Death were felt for years. While the initial aftermath saw shortages and inflation due to the sudden loss of workers, the long-term impact was more complex. With fewer people, land and goods became more available, allowing some survivors to gain wealth and status that would have been impossible before. Cities that had once been overcrowded saw a rise in living standards as resources were no longer stretched as thin. The plague had even changed how people thought about health and disease. Although medieval medicine had little understanding of germs or how illnesses spread, the need for quarantine, sanitation, and hygiene became more widely accepted. Some cities began implementing public health measures that would later influence the development of modern medicine. By the end of 1351, the worst of the Black Death had passed, but the world that emerged from its shadow was vastly different from the one that had existed before. The survivors were left to pick up the pieces, adjusting to a reality where nothing, not their communities, their beliefs, or their way of life, would ever be the same. By the time the Black Death finally subsided in 1353, the world had been permanently changed. The plague had reshaped Europe's population, economy, and society in ways that would be felt for centuries. But while the worst was over, its effects did not simply vanish. The scars it left behind continued to shape history long after the last wave of the disease faded. One of the most immediate and lasting consequences was the shift in power between the ruling elite and the working class. Before the Black Death, the feudal system had kept peasants tied to the land, working for lords in exchange for basic protections. But after so many laborers had died, those who remained realized they had leverage. Lords could no longer dictate low wages because workers were scarce, and many peasants began demanding better pay and conditions. Some even left their villages in search of higher wages elsewhere, something that would have been unthinkable before. This gradual breakdown of the feudal system paved the way for the rise of a new middle class and the eventual movement toward a more modern economy. Another major change was in how people viewed life itself. After witnessing so much death and destruction, many survivors adopted a new outlook, one that valued living in the moment. This shift in thinking played a role in the cultural and artistic transformations that followed. In the decades after the Black Death, Europe saw a renewed interest in science, learning, and creativity, an early sign of what would later become the Renaissance. Some historians even believe that the plague helped accelerate this period of intellectual and artistic growth, as people sought to rebuild their world in a way that was richer and more meaningful than before. Medicine, too, was forever altered. While doctors in the 14th century had little understanding of germs, the sheer scale of the Black Death forced medical practitioners to experiment with new treatments and public health measures. The idea of quarantines, for example, became more widely accepted after cities like Venice successfully slowed the spread of the disease by isolating arriving ships. Over time, these early attempts at disease control influenced future medical advancements, eventually leading to better sanitation practices and a deeper understanding of how illnesses spread. But even as Europe slowly recovered, the Black Death never fully disappeared. Outbreaks of plague continued to emerge over the next several centuries. Though none were as devastating as the initial wave, the disease resurfaced in cycles, reminding people of the horrors they had once endured. However, each outbreak also brought new efforts to contain and prevent its spread, further shaping the way societies responded to disease. Looking back, the Black Death was more than just a catastrophic natural disaster. It was a turning point in human history. It upended long-standing social structures, changed economic systems, and even influenced cultural and scientific advancements. The world that emerged after the plague was not the same as the one that had existed before, and in many ways, the lessons learned from that dark period helped shape the modern era. Even today, the Black Death remains one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history. Its impact is still studied by historians, scientists, and medical experts trying to understand how societies respond to widespread disease. While modern medicine has come a long way since the 14th century, the echoes of the Black Death remind us that humanity has faced and survived devastating pandemics before. Thanks for watching, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What surprised you most about the Black Death? Let me know, and don't forget to tune in for my next video, where I'll be diving into more historical disasters and events.